The first sound they heard was not gunfire. It was boots on gravel. For weeks, the women of the small coastal settlement had hidden inside an abandoned rice warehouse near the edge of the jungle. The war around them had slowly faded into silence. The aircraft that once filled the sky were gone. The distant explosions had stopped. But the quiet did not bring peace. It brought fear, because everyone knew what came next. Capture. Rumors had spread long before the soldiers arrived. Retreating Japanese troops had warned the villagers in hurried whispers. If the Americans find you, do not expect mercy. Some soldiers had spoken in darker tones, saying the enemy would humiliate women, that capture meant losing honor forever. Mothers repeated those warnings again and again until they became something stronger than rumor. They became certainty. Inside the warehouse, nearly 20 women sat close together on the dusty wooden floor. Some held children in their arms. Others clutched small bundles of clothing and family keepsakes. No one spoke loudly. Even breathing felt dangerous. Then the boots stopped outside the door. A shadow crossed the broken doorway. Someone whispered, "They're here." The wooden door creaked open slowly, letting sunlight spill into the dark room. An American soldier stepped inside. His helmet cast a shadow over his eyes. A rifle hung across his chest, but it was pointed down toward the ground. Behind him stood several more soldiers, watching quietly. The women pressed themselves against the wall as far as they could go. One mother pulled her daughter behind her. Everyone waited. They expected shouting. They expected rough hands. They expected the moment their worst fears would become real. Instead, the soldier simply raised one hand and said something calmly in English. The women did not understand the words. A moment later, another man stepped forward. He spoke Japanese slowly, carefully. "You are safe," he translated. "You will not be harmed." No one moved. No one believed him. The soldiers did not approach the women. Instead, one of them placed a metal container on the floor near the doorway. "Water." Another soldier set down a small box beside it. Inside were several cans of food. Then they stepped back. Far back. The women watched every movement carefully. Some thought it must be a trick. Others believed the soldiers were waiting for them to step forward so they could punish them. Minutes passed. The Americans said nothing. Finally, a young mother named Emiko slowly reached toward the water container. Her hands shook so badly that the tin cup rattled against the metal edge. She took a small sip. Nothing happened. The soldiers remained where they stood, watching quietly. Then one of the children began to cry softly. Another woman opened one of the food cans with trembling fingers. The smell of warm soup drifted through the room. The child stopped crying immediately. Soon the quiet warehouse filled with the small sounds of people eating carefully, still glancing nervously toward the doorway. The soldiers never stepped closer. They simply waited. As the sun began to set, the women were guided outside. The soldiers led them to a small open area near the village. A row of blankets had been placed neatly on the ground. The interpreter spoke again. "You can rest here tonight." The women looked at one another with confusion. They had expected cages or locked rooms. Instead, the soldiers positioned themselves several meters away, forming a loose guard around the clearing. One of the younger women whispered nervously, "Why are they staying so far away?" No one had an answer. That night the women barely slept. They waited for footsteps, for voices, for the moment the soldiers would enter the clearing. But the moment never came. Instead, they only heard the distant murmur of guards quietly talking to one another beyond the edge of the firelight. Morning arrived with something unexpected. Breakfast. Several soldiers carried crates into the clearing and placed them near the women. Bread, fruit, and more water. Again the same pattern repeated. The soldiers stepped back immediately. They avoided staring directly at the women. It felt strangely formal, almost like a silent agreement neither side had spoken aloud. Later that afternoon, a military medic arrived. He carried a canvas bag and a small notebook. Through the interpreter, he explained gently that he wished to check if any of the children were sick. The women hesitated. For a long time no one stepped forward. Finally, Emiko brought her young son forward. The medic crouched down slowly so the boy would not feel frightened. He listened to the child's breathing with a small instrument and smiled. "Strong lungs," he said. Then he gave the boy a piece of candy. The boy looked at it as if it were treasure, and suddenly laughed. It was the first laugh anyone had heard since the capture. Even some of the soldiers smiled quietly. Days passed. Then a week. The routine never changed. Food arrived regularly. Clean water was brought every morning. Soap and brushes appeared one evening so the women could wash. And always the same distance remained between prisoners and guards. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, the women sat together whispering. A quiet young woman named Eiko finally spoke the question everyone had been thinking. "Why haven't they harmed us?" Her voice trembled slightly. "We were told they would." An older woman named Mrs. Tanaka, who had lived through many difficult years before the war, shook her head slowly. "Perhaps they are simply tired of fighting." No one knew if that was true, but the idea settled gently in their minds. A few days later, something happened that changed everything. A soldier approached the edge of the camp, carrying a wooden box. He placed it carefully on the ground and stepped away. Inside were paper sheets and pencils. The interpreter explained, "You may write messages to your families." The women stared in disbelief. Letters. They had believed their families would never know if they were alive. One by one, they began writing. Some wrote carefully. Others struggled to find the right words. Eiko wrote only a few short lines to her parents. "I am safe, please do not worry." Tears fell onto the paper as she finished. The soldiers collected the letters quietly and placed them into a canvas bag. For the first time since the war ended, hope appeared in the camp. As the weeks passed, the fear that had once filled the women's hearts slowly changed. The guards still kept their distance. They still avoided unnecessary contact. But the women began to notice small details. The soldiers spoke gently to the children. They waited patiently when the interpreter explained instructions. Sometimes they even left small extra pieces of fruit where the children would find them. One evening, Mrs. Tanaka spoke softly to the younger women. "All our lives we were told the enemy would destroy us," she said. "But look around you." The women glanced at the quiet camp. Children were drawing pictures in the dirt. The evening air was calm. Guards stood watch at the edge of the clearing, facing outward toward the road. Protecting the camp, not threatening it. Mrs. Tanaka finished her thought quietly. Perhaps the war taught everyone enough already. The true realization came slowly. Not in a single moment, but through many quiet days. Days when nothing terrible happened. Days when the soldiers simply kept their distance. Days when the women were allowed to live with dignity. One afternoon Eiko looked across the camp and noticed something she had never expected. The guards were no longer frightening. They were simply men doing their duty. Tired men. Young men far from home. Just like the soldiers she had seen before the war ended. She turned to Emiko and whispered softly, "They really will not harm us." Emiko nodded. Yes, she said. I think we understand that now. Months later, when the women were finally allowed to return home, many of them struggled to explain what had happened. Their families expected stories of suffering. But the women remembered something different. They remembered the quiet distance the soldiers kept. They remembered blankets laid carefully on the ground. They remembered letters sent home. And most of all, they remembered the strange and powerful moment when their deepest fears slowly faded away. For them, the most unforgettable part of the war was not violence. It was the moment they realized the people they had feared most had chosen not to harm them. Sometimes history changes not through great battles, but through simple acts of restraint that remind people of their shared humanity.